When the rule of law fails, Sweden's hidden legal scandal. Sweden often markets itself as one of the world's most law-abiding democracies, where laws and order guarantee the protection of individuals against abuses of power. But behind this facade lies another reality, one where people are caught between bureaucracy, arbitrary decisions, and an administrative apparatus that often places its own convenience over the demands of the law. When the legal system fails its most fundamental principle, Sweden often markets itself as one of the world's most law-abiding democracies, where laws and order guarantee the protection of individuals against abuses of power. But behind this facade lies another reality, one where people are caught between bureaucracy, arbitrary decisions, and an administrative apparatus that often places its own convenience over the demands of the law. When the legal system fails its most fundamental principles, who protects the citizens from the state? The Swedish legal system is a labyrinth where once an individual is ensnared, they may fight for years to obtain justice, even though the letter of the law should be on their side. Social services, the courts, and the prison service are supposed to uphold justice and security, but in practice, they often act as a concrete wall where people's rights are crushed between bureaucratic processes and officials' unwillingness to admit mistakes. Social services, the bureaucracy that delays and destroys. For those dependent on social services for support, every month can feel like a nightmare of unanswered questions, lost documents, and suddenly changed demands. Social services have a legal obligation to assist those in need, but the reality is different. Instead of providing timely help, they use their power to delay, question, and deny, often on grounds that contradict both Swedish law and international conventions. If an application can't be rejected outright, barriers are created. The same documents are repeatedly requested. Certificates previously accepted are suddenly rejected. Officials demand evidence that doesn't exist or that violates legal practices. When the applicant finally manages to prove their case, social services suddenly release their demands without acknowledging their mistake. But by then, months of suffering have already passed. Those who dare question or appeal are often punished with even longer waiting times and more arbitrary requirements. This is not an isolated occurrence. It is a systemic flaw where the agency acts as judge, jury, and executioner for some of society's most vulnerable. The courts. When justice becomes a lottery, Swedish courts are supposed to guarantee a fair and impartial trial. But what happens when judges themselves start bending the limits of the law? In increasing cases, we see the burden of proof shifted, where the accused must prove their innocence rather than the prosecution proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Vague circumstantial evidence, misinterpreted proof, and loosely based allegations may be enough for a guilty verdict, even though legal principles dictate that no one should be convicted without concrete evidence. Perhaps the most disturbing issue is the inconsistency in how the law is applied. The same crime can lead to entirely different outcomes depending on which court hears the case. Some judges follow precedent, while others interpret the law based on their own views, creating an unpredictable legal environment. And what happens when courts make mistakes? Almost nothing. Getting an incorrect verdict reviewed is a near impossible process, with petitions for reconsideration rarely granted, regardless of how strong the evidence of innocence is. In a legal system, no one should be convicted arbitrarily, but in Sweden, your future can be decided by chance rather than law. The prison and probation services, authorities above the law. If you think a judgment should only be enforced once it's final, think again. In Sweden, there have been cases where probation authorities have acted as though judgments were final, even though they were still under appeal. There are instances where officials have provided false information to justify detention orders, claiming that people have been unreachable despite documented attempts to make contact. Once the court intervenes and halts the enforcement, the damage has already been done. The individual's freedom has been restricted, their rights violated. How can this happen in a rule of law? The answer is simple: a lack of oversight and accountability. When the state breaks the law, who holds it accountable? In Sweden, there are oversight bodies designed to monitor the actions of the state, but how effective are they really? The Parliamentary Ombudsman, J.O., and the Chancellor of Justice, J.K., have the authority to review agencies, but their decisions are practically toothless. A government body that breaks the law may receive a reprimand, but no real consequences. Officials who make illegal decisions keep their jobs. Incorrect judgments are rarely corrected. For the individual, this becomes an uphill battle, where appeals take years and real justice is often just a theoretical possibility. Meanwhile, people suffer. They go hungry, they are wrongfully imprisoned, and they lose years of their lives to bureaucracy's grinding wheels. Sweden is no longer a rule of law. It's time to open our eyes. It's easy to believe that legal violations only happen in corrupt regimes, in faraway lands. But they happen here in Sweden every day. They affect people who follow the law, who fight for their rights, and yet they are crushed by a system that has forgotten its own purpose. We now face a critical question. Should we continue to turn a blind eye to these systemic flaws and allow the state to trample on the law? Or should we demand real accountability, real justice, and a society where the rule of law means something, not just on paper, but in practice? The truth is uncomfortable, but it must be said. For the rule of law in Sweden is on the verge of collapsing, and if we don't act now, it may soon be too late.